This week, we're off to ancient Alexandria for episode 18 of season 2 of Travels Through Time. Hello, I'm Artemis, one of the presenters on Travels Through Time, and today we're going back to the year 415 to find out about the dazzling life and brutal death of the only female scholar in antiquity, Hypatia of Alexandria. Female scholars were few and far between in the ancient world. Women were rarely educated, and even when they were, hardly any evidence survives about them. There is, however, one glittering exception, the astronomer and mathematician Hypatia, whose brilliance was the cause of both her enormous success and her dramatic downfall. In the early 5th century, Alexandria was in turmoil, as tensions within the various ethnic and religious populations began to boil over. Just a few years before, in 392, a Christian mob had destroyed the mighty temple of Serapis and all of the books that were shelved in it. The ancient pagan world was under attack, and Hypatia, as a woman, pagan, and an intellectual, became the focal point, with tragic results that have echoed down the centuries. Our guide on this journey to ancient Alexandria is the award-winning historian Catherine Nixey, whose fascinating book, The Darkening Age, looked at how the Christian faith struggled and eventually triumphed over classical culture. It is a compelling and at times shocking story that has been described as engaging and erudite, elegant and ferocious. Violet Moller went along to Reading the other day to talk to Catherine. We hope you enjoy their conversation.
Welcome to Travels Through Time, Catherine.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Before we start, I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about Alexandria and really set the scene of what it would have been like in the early 5th century to live there.
It would have been glorious. Of all the ancient cities, when you look back as a historical tourist and you think, where would I like to go? And you think, of all of the places in the Roman Empire, Alexandria wins it. According to legend, it was set out by Alexander the Great himself, one of around 17 or 18 cities he founded in his own name. Not a modest man, but a great one. And he had nothing else to set the city out with, so he drizzled grain along the ground saying where everything would be. And one of the most interesting things about the city is that from the very beginning, there was a library there. It was one of the earliest and one of the most famous libraries in the ancient world. But before you even get to that, the city itself was beautiful. It was set on the edge of the Mediterranean, so it had this wonderful climate. Ancient geographers write about this beautiful blue sky, only ever with a few scudding white clouds. And the city itself was built to make the most of it, so it had its streets aligned with the sea breezes, so that every afternoon a cooling breeze would go along these wonderful, dazzlingly white marble streets. It was just full of marvels. It had one of the wonders of the ancient world. It had the great lighthouse of Alexandria, which was built in the bay to guide ships in, which you can see a replica of, actually. If you go to Fleet Street today, it's said that the Tower of Fleet Street Church is built, supposedly, like one of the drawings of the great lighthouse of Alexandria. And it's what wedding cakes were modelled on later. I'm sure most of it's entirely erroneous, but so goes the story. And it also had, most famously, it had this library inside the museum. And we get the word museum from this, but it actually just meant a shrine to the muses, who were the goddesses of creativity and intellectual endeavour.
Wow, it sounds amazing. But I think something I often forget, or people often forget, is that we are talking about centuries later. So how similar do you think the city would have been to how it was just after it was founded by the 5th century? Because we're talking about 800 years later, aren't we, pretty much?
Yeah, the classical period is a long time. That's what you always need to remember. Yes, it is almost a millennium later, and it's taken a few knocks in that period. It's grown also. It's now perhaps 1 million people, but it has also taken some pretty serious knocks, chief among them about 30 years earlier, 30 years before we're looking at the year 415 AD. In 392 AD, one of the most striking landmarks in Alexandria, which was this temple of Serapis, which stood perched above the city at the top of 100 steps, was seen for miles around and famous across the empire. It had been knocked down, it had been razed to the ground by a mob of angry Christians. And as well as that, lots of the statues that peopled the city had also been defaced by this mob of Christians who'd rampaged through. And it's hard for us to understand because people have completely forgotten about the Temple of Serapis today. It's hard to understand quite how serious this was. When ancient writers write about the beautiful temples in their empire, they don't write, as we would expect, about the Parthenon. They don't write about the Pantheon. What they write about is this single temple standing above Alexandria at the top of those famous 100 marble steps. And the shock of it being torn down, as it was by Christians in 392 AD, resounds through the literature like nothing else of that period except perhaps the sack of Rome. It was a massive blow to intellectuals and everyone.
And were the scrolls inside it all destroyed at that same time? How complete was the destruction?
This is one of those great questions that you never quite know in history. There was the remains of the Great Library of Alexandria, which really had been great. People say maybe 700,000 scrolls by the 3rd century AD. And if you compare that to later monastic libraries, which are the famous ones, people write a lot about these monastic libraries. They had maybe 500 texts. This had 700,000. It wouldn't be until the 14th century that the library in the Sorbonne in Paris only had 1,200, and it had managed to lose most of them.
Yeah, it's a shocking comparison.
I mean, it's extraordinary. Not for a millennium did anything approach this library. And the library had various knocks, and it had been put for safekeeping inside the Serapeum, this wonderful temple. And they vanished. Nobody knows what happened to them. Gibbon, who was no friend of the Christians, said that they were scattered to the wind. And, you can see the fury in his writing about them. Nobody knows. They went. They were never refound.
Goodness. So Alexandria was obviously a place of quite a lot of unrest and social problems during this period. Can you go into a bit more detail about the Christians and the pagan communities? And I believe also there was a big Jewish community. Can you just go into a bit of detail about what was going on exactly during this period in the lead up to 415?
Of course. So we're putting a pin in the fabric of the Roman Empire at this particular place and this particular time. It is 100 years after Constantine, the first Christian emperor, has seen his famous vision of the cross. And from that moment when Constantine saw the cross in the sky, the whole path of the Roman Empire had turned. That path is sort of reaching its culmination now. Christian writers are daring to claim that there are no non-Christians left, but then they undermine their own claim by quickly saying, and if there are, we have to stop them. So the empire has gone within a century from being the vast majority of people being what we would call pagan to the vast majority of people being what we would call Christian. And that hasn't happened without some awkwardness. And the Serapeum is one example of that awkwardness. Fights in the streets are another example of that awkwardness. And a generalised feeling of rancour between those who've remained pagan, who are largely the upper classes, it seems, and those who have turned Christian, which is largely everyone else. So at this time in Alexandria, what you have, almost two Roman empires sitting side by side. The new Christian Roman Empire is coming into being. But pushing back against it is the old pagan Roman Empire and those pagan aristocrats who have a totally different way of doing things and who don't believe in the Christian way and who don't like these new bishops who keep turning up everywhere and flexing their muscles and who are, frankly, many of them, furious at what they see as the desecration and the destruction that has been done.
And that takes us quite neatly onto your first scene, which I believe involves the bishop.
Yes. So a new bishop has just arrived in Alexandria, a new patriarch. He's called Cyril. And he sounds a bit like a baddie, and he is, it turns out, quite an unpleasant character. He is, in fact, the nephew of the patriarch Theophilus, who, among his credits, counts tearing down the Serapeum. And it seems there is something of a family resemblance, because this man, even Christians had serious doubts about him. He's a saint now in the Eastern Orthodox Church, but he is described by one council of bishops as, fantastic phrase, he's a monster born and educated for the destruction of the church. And
goodness me, that's quite an epitaph.
I know, isn't it? And it proves to be so. So he turns up in Alexandria, in this city, which is a melting pot of various cultures. Sorry, that's a terrible cliche, but it's taking in trade ships from all over the empire and people from all over the empire and religions from all over the empire, and they simmer, and they are simmering at this moment when Cyril arrives, and he tips it all over the edge. he dislikes the Jewish population there. There is a huge Jewish population in Alexandria, and like everything in Alexandria, it has a legend to it. They say that there were 100,000 Jews who were there, they were prisoners of war. And one of the Ptolemies wanted to translate the Jewish texts, but he couldn't get any of his Greek scholars to do it. They didn't know, this was hundreds of years before. So Ptolemy wants to translate the Jewish texts, and he doesn't know how to do it. So he applies to the Jewish elders. He says, will you translate it? And they say, okay, we will translate it if, and there is a big if you set free these 100,000 prisoners of war. And such is the zest and the zeal of Ptolemies for getting every book translated, they say, fine, we will do it. Have your 100,000 prisoners of war. They get their 70 scholars, and the first translation into Greek of the Old Testament is made, the Septuagint. And that's why it's called the Septuagint, because of those 70 scholars that they get.
And so from that moment on, which was of course a long time before when we're talking about, before, there was a big established Jewish community.
An established Jewish population, and this annoys Cyril. There's a large Jewish population, and one of the reasons you think it probably does annoy Cyril is that the Jews and the pagans both have these ample places of worship. They have grand temples and they have synagogues. And the Christians are still at this moment in cramped little house churches. They have nothing to compare. So there's various scuffles and toings and froings. And then there's an edict passed that says a certain celebration has to stop. Now, this doesn't sound like much, but it enrages the Jews, who then have a fight with the Christians.
But it's not a religious celebration.
It's not, no, it's what they call mimetic, which means nothing to us today, but it was basically a festival which involved dancing.
And so would that festival have been something that all religions, everyone in Alexandria would have enjoyed?
Yes, apart from the more pious Christians, yes.
Of course, yeah.
But definitely some Christians did enjoy it, and it was outlawed. And for the reasons are murky. The texts that you have for this period are pretty threadbare. But what is clear is that this annoys some Christians, but it really annoys some Jews, who then set a trap for some Christians. There's a massive fight. Some Christians are killed. And at that moment, Cyril takes his chance and goes for his revenge.
Okay. And that's scene 2, isn't it?
Yes, this is scene 2.
Okay, so just staying with scene 1 for a second, I'd like to discover more about who appoints Cyril, where does he come from, and how does he interact with the other people who are running Alexandria at that time? What's the kind of church-state situation? Because, as you say, the church is still quite new and small and not enormously established yet. So how does that work?
It's such an interesting question. And this is one of the great things of this period, that you have two massive and ambitious bureaucracies start grinding against each other. So you get amazing descriptions of where the old hierarchy, the old Greco-Roman hierarchy of governors and judges and all the bureaucracy that Rome had put in place to run an empire, starts bumping into the new Christian bureaucracy of bishops and all of the clerics who are ruling in a certain area. And they clash time and time again. And what you see is one side pushing, trying to gain supremacy over the other side. There's an amazing scene where in Antioch, and it really puts it into a vivid picture almost, that you can see just how distressing this was for people who were witnessing it. A judge sits down in a church in Antioch, and then he hears the chanting of monks appearing outside. And what he knows is that basically what this means is he is involved in a case which involves a Christian, and if he doesn't rule right, the monks are going to use force against him. So he jumps up out of his seat and runs away and says no justice can be exercised when they have appeared. And this is almost precisely what you see in Alexandria. So you have a governor in place, Arrestees, a Greek, aristocratic. He is in fact a baptized Christian, but he is very much in the old Roman mould, the old Greco-Roman mould. He does things by the book. He does things the Roman way. And then you have this bishop, Cyril. And they clearly, quite obviously, dislike each other. So Arrestees continues trying to do things in his way, and he has the power of a Roman governor, but he has no power that compares to the bishops, because at this period, the bishops are not just standing in front of their congregations and saying nice words, they are beginning to command militias. And in Alexandria, they have 800 men who are known as the Parabolani, which means the reckless ones, and they are effectively his soldiers. They make his will happen on the ground.
I heard that the Parabolani, they had a job. I mean, they did, wasn't it their job to remove dead bodies?
Yes, so they were called reckless. Initially, there was no infrastructure, medical infrastructure, in the way that we would imagine it in the ancient world. So if somebody died on the street, they were just left there to rot. If somebody was sick, they were just left in the street being ill. Now, you can't really run a city like that. Well, you can, the Romans did, but it can go wrong quite fast. And one of the things that the Christians were extremely good at were looking after the sick and the dying. And so these Parabolani, what their main job was to, as stretcher bearers, they would pick up these bodies, take them to what hospitals, not hospitals as we would understand them, take them to care, places where they would be cared for, and they would take away dead bodies.
So these young men were obviously extremely fervent in their beliefs.
Yes, strong Christians, and literally strong Christians. They were muscular young men doing God's work. They were completely illiterate as well, so they had a fairly elastic idea of what God's work was. Mainly, they were directed by the bishop. So if they knew that there was a trial going on in a law court and the Christian bishop wanted it, our patriarch wanted it to go one way, you would find the Parabolani would mass outside the law court. And
terrifying,
completely terrifying. They wouldn't necessarily do anything, but they were there.
But just
and
their presence would probably
their presence
be
was enough, and you were a brave judge if you ruled against.
Goodness. So they played quite an important role, I believe, in your second scene. Did they?
Yes, in the attack on Arrestees.
Yes.
So at this moment in Alexandria, the simmering tensions have got even worse. And Cyril has decided to take his revenge on the Jews for the murder of the Christians.
Tell us more about Arrestees.
Well, the sources are slightly scant on him, but I always think he must have been terribly attractive. There are no physical descriptions of him, sadly. But he was such an interesting man. He was a Christian. This comes up later. He says, I am a baptized Christian. Yet he is friends with Hypatia, who is this hugely charismatic woman who everybody wants a piece of. So when visiting nobles come to Alexandria, they don't go to Cyril, and this must rankle with him. They turn up at Hypatia's house and pay homage to her, in effect. And they greet her, and people come to her lectures from miles around, from Syria, from Rome. Everyone wants to be educated by her. She was just quite brilliant.
And that's something that Arrestees celebrates, even though he is a Christian and she is...
Yes, even though he is a Christian, even though he is a man in a terribly hierarchical, male-dominated world, he is friends with Hypatia. And they seem to be quite close, because there's enough rumours in the city, later we'll come on to that, but there are rumours in the city that they are close in a way that many find difficult and sinister.
Having an affair?
Not having an affair, no, a more satanic kind of closeness.
Oh, right.
I think that she is beguiling him by Satan.
Yes, that's always the charge levelled
yes.
at powerful women.
Powerful women, yes, it begins here. And yeah.
So we've got this situation with Arrestees and the Parabolani.
Yes, so then you have this scene where you have Cyril with the 800 Parabolani behind him. And Alexandria is very uncomfortable about these people because they pop up in the legal code. They are mentioned, and the word terror, which is exactly the same in Latin, is used against them because they are spreading terror among the city, and their numbers have to be limited. And so Cyril is already a dubious man, and he tells the Parabolani to go and purify, is the word he uses, which basically always means steal, purify the Jews of their synagogues. So they sweep through the city, they kick out the Jews into the desert, and they purify them, in inverted commas, of their synagogues, which then, of course, are put over to Christian use as churches. And then they also purify them, in inverted commas, of their possessions, which means their houses. So you have Jews left destitute in the desert, Christians taking up their homes and their synagogues and turning them into churches. And Arrestees can do nothing about this, because Roman governors essentially rule, like most rulers, on trust and on the assumption that everyone will obey the state. And the Christians aren't obeying the state. There's basically nothing he can do. He has no militia to match the militia that the bishop is wielding. And so he writes to the emperor. And this enrages Cyril, because Cyril thinks he's done exactly the right thing. He has got rid of the Jews, and he has cleansed their synagogues, which at this time you start to get lots of anti-Jewish writings in Christian texts. So John Chrysostom starts to write about how synagogues are the dwelling place of demons and houses of robbers. And Chrysostom is an odious man, and his sermons are then reprinted in Nazi Germany.
Of course, yeah, you can see
With
that.
zest,
Totally.
yes. So you're beginning to get...
anti-Semitism.
You're beginning to get, yes, the start of a very virulent and unpleasant anti-Semitism.
And that must have been a huge moment in the city for everyone, even if you weren't Jewish or Christian. You know, it must have caused a lot of violence and really noticeable change within the city.
It does, and you're starting to get what you hadn't before: hardening of religious lines. So previously, you'd had pagans who could go to Jewish ceremonies, and Jews would come to Christian. You know,
they'd lived harmoniously.
Yes, previously they'd lived harmoniously, and everyone would worship one god and then another god, and there was no conception, there was nothing to match the monotheism that Christianity brought in. There was no idea that you could not worship this god and that god, and that is what you're starting to get. And so you're starting to get a hardening sectarian lines appearing, and vicious fights breaking out in between them. And pagans found this astonishing. They found it amazing that they believed in a multiplicity of gods and got on fine, and Christians seemed to believe in one god, spent their entire time fighting with each other.
Well, and quite often within Christianity.
Yes, because...
Isn't that also true? Didn't Cyril punish a whole load of Christians who he felt weren't worshipping in the correct manner?
Yes, because heresy is starting to appear, and you're getting the idea that there's not just one God, there's one way of worshipping one God.
Yes,
and that will, again, that's the start of something that will continue for a millennium.
Yeah.
So what is written and what is copied out changes. And what is noticed by scholars is that what disappears is a sense of fun. So the classical world had been massively irreverent and, to modernise,
lots of humour, lots of
humour. Yes, humour, satire, poking fun at everyone from the emperor.
Plays.
Yes.
Novels.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. To the gods. The gods are mocked, philosophers are mocked, everything is mocked. So the emperor, one emperor is said to turn into a god, and somebody writes a satire called The Pumpkinification of him, to imply that he's a ridiculous creature. And there's also lots of bawdy writing, which becomes very troublesome to later Christians.
And love poetry.
Love poetry, yes. And wonderful love poetry and vivid poetry. No part of the body is off limits, no sexual act is off limits, everything is written about. And then Christianity comes, and this sense of fun, more than anything else, goes. And you get sermons, often hectoring, and this is one of the striking things about the writing of this period, is just that sense of irreverent joy disappears.
But isn't it that thing, as I think Stephen Greenblatt wrote about this in The Swerve, that the sort of big difference was that in the pagan world, pain was awful, and you just avoided pain as much as you possibly could and made your life as happy as you could on earth. And of course then when Christianity comes in, particularly that sort of early medieval period, it flips, and it's all about the more pain you endure on earth, the better time you're going to have when you die and go to heaven.
Yes, it's so interesting, isn't it? Those floor mosaics, which I have a picture of a skeleton with a bottle of wine in one hand and a loaf of bread in the other, saying, enjoy your life.
Yeah.
They disappear.
That's a fascinating kind of sort of huge societal change.
It's a huge societal change.
And John is
John Chrysostom is one of the... So in this period, he's one of the most well-known... Chrysostom means literally golden mouth. So he was so charismatic that he wrote about how people would pack into his church to see his sermons, as if I was a rock star. Anyway, but his writing, it hasn't withstood the test of time. So in one book, if you look up just in the index, you get a taste of what John Chrysostom, what his work is like, and I have one here. So in the index of a collection of his sermons, you can get a taste of what the whole thing is like. So if you look under the word fear, you are offered Needful to Holy Men, page 334, A Chastisement for Carelessness, 347, Of the Lord True Riches, 351, A Punishment, 355, Awakens Conscience, 363, A Good Man Firm Against, 369, Without the Fear of Hell, Death Terrible, 374, Fear of Hell is Profitable, and it goes on. You get 25 references on fear in John Chrysostom.
How many on fun?
Well, yes, and it ends in just the... The final one in fear is purifies like a furnace, lest you should be...
Oh my goodness.
Lest you should be in any doubt. Under happiness, you would get merely in God alone, page 460. And I think it says it all.
That says it all. It does. It really does. And so what happens to Arrestees at this point?
So Arrestees writes to the emperor, and you don't really hear hear much of a response. But Cyril is enraged by this. And then he starts to call in supply troops almost. Living in the hills around Alexandria are monks, and they generally live lives of isolation. They pray at dawn, they pray at dusk, but they often just live in can be as simple as holes. They're not in monasteries so much. They're living their own life of personal asceticism, unwashed, unlettered, most of them. But they somehow get the call and they start to mass in the city. So as well as the 800 Parabolani, you get, the sources say, around 500 monks who come down from the hills around. And so you now have a huge presence of Christians in the city, and it's very threatening. And one day, after Arrestees has complained to the emperor about what Cyril did to the Jews, he suddenly finds himself surrounded by not just the Parabolani, but these monks.
Must have been terrifying.
Completely terrifying. They are a sinister presence in and of themselves. They're outside the city, which in those times says a lot. They're not behaving in the usual way of civilized men, literally Kiwis, men who are of this city. They are something else, and they surround his chariot, and his retinue, who completely rightly realise that they're utterly outnumbered, vanish. So he is left on his own, and one of the monks picks up a stone and throws it at Arrestees, and it hits him on the head, and blood starts to pour down and covers his clothes. Now, at that moment, you get the faintest whiff of what the general feeling was. Texts in this period are not very good at describing what the common man thought, but it's clear that the people of Alexandria are the ones who protect Arrestees. So there's some sort of movement among the locals, and he escapes, the monks disperse, and the feud between him and Cyril gets even deeper.
But presumably for the local people of Alexandria, this was the most appalling breakdown of the social order.
Yes.
Their ruler was, someone was throwing stones at their ruler. I mean, that must have been a very frightening proposition, because if that can happen, then, there's no law and order, or I don't know what extent law and order existed at that time, but I imagine in a big city like Alexandria, people were able to go about their daily business without fear of a mob surrounding them.
Yes, they had been. And certainly, you could always have mobs, you could always have riots, but you weren't having them directed by one person in this way. You weren't getting a kind of alternate state, which is what Christianity is bringing
state
in.
within a state.
Yes.
So this presages what happens next, which is your third scene. Tell us about that.
So this is one of the most famous scenes in all of the clashes between what we call the pagans and the Christians, and it's the murder of Hypatia of Alexandria. And it's so famous that the Christians in the end take it over and they invent a saint called Catherine of Alexandria, to whom they attribute various academic qualifications, and then she gets murdered by the Romans in the Christian story. But it's thought there was no Catherine of Alexandria. It's thought that this was Hypatia. And
Hypatia, as I said in my introduction, is really the only female scholar who we have any information about. It's a source of great personal sadness to me when I study the history of ideas. How did she become educated? Because in those days, it was extremely unusual for women to be given any kind of education. Tell us a bit about her special upbringing.
Right, wonderful. Extremely unusual for anyone to become educated, full stop. And then even more unusual for a woman. So the Victorians loved Hypatia. They liked her as a perfect example of kind of rational thought in the face of irrational forces. And they were also prone to paint her. Well, there's a wonderful Victorian painting of her.
Charles Kingsley wrote
very lusciously about her and her grandis beauty of the old Greek kind, and curving nose and lips and things like that. And she was generally regarded as a great beauty, bit of a hottie. There's a famous Victorian painting of her standing naked with tumbling blonde locks just about covering her modesty, not very much, next to an old altar. And that's by a Victorian, Charles William Mitchell. And that's the image that the Victorians had of her. Unfortunately, it's bunk. She didn't stand naked next to any altars. She almost certainly didn't have tumbling blonde locks. She dressed very chastely. So she was a philosopher. She was devoted to the life of the mind. And so she wore the philosopher's cloak, which all philosophers wore. And by the time this episode, by the time we get to 415, when we meet her, she's not elderly, but certainly past late middle age. And she is also extremely chaste. So she's certainly not going around pouting. There's an amazing anecdote about one of her students falls in love with her. And he confesses his love. He plucks up his courage and confesses his love. And she turns up at their next lecture and throws her sanitary towel at him and says, "You love this, young man, and there's nothing beautiful about it."
Goodness me, that's one way of
turning down a suitor. Anyway, it didn't go any further.
But what about her father? Because wasn't her father?
Yes, so this is
mathematician?
Yeah. So the facts that we have of her, if you go away from this romantic, hazy ideal, is that she was the daughter of Theon, who was himself a brilliant mathematician. So Theon edited Euclid's Maths. And when you used a maths book up until the 20th century, you were using the word works of Theon because he'd annotated Euclid. And he taught his daughter, and she, by all accounts, was even more brilliant than he was. So we call her a philosopher, but actually she would be better off being called a mathematician. That's what she was. And she worked with mathematical symbols, she worked with astrolabes, and how she worked is important because it would later become involved in the charges that were levelled against her by people who had no idea who couldn't even write, let alone do maths.
And who was suspicious, therefore, about this incredible knowledge that she had.
Yes, who were suspicious about her knowledge, and who were suspicious the church at this point. Heretical movements of the church had promoted women and had allowed women to do things, but the Christianity that we get, that is coming to the forefront at this point, is very male. And it is...
Oh, that's interesting. So early on, there were actually movements within the Christian church.
Yeah.
That promoted women.
Well, there are movements within the church in which God has feminine forms. There are ones in which the Holy Spirit is female. And
really?
And then women officiate in ceremonies, but the Christianity we get is male and aggressively male. And there was a female apostle, for instance, Junia, but her name is masculinized by later scribes who are unwilling to allow
a woman to have such a starring role.
Yeah.
So Hypatia is this obviously very powerful, intelligent. I heard one description of her as the luminous child of reason.
Yes, her
just
pupils,
beautiful.
Yes, her pupils get very keen on her, and she's teaching the most educated and privileged young men of the empire, and they write letters to each other saying how wonderful. Luminous child of reason is one, and they say, another one writes about how the whole city was beguiled by her. They adore her. People turn up at her house. Her house is always crowded. Her lectures are packed, and Arrestees is among those visiting her.
So it's really as a teacher that she is extremely important, because I think during this period of scientific progress, it wasn't so much a period of discovery and of new ideas. It was more a period where ideas were being digested and processed and communicated. Yeah. And that was, her and her father Theon played a hugely important role in the communication and passing on of this kind of knowledge. So she's obviously a very, very powerful woman in Alexandria, very, very well known. And this is, of course, going to make people like Cyril notice her and make her a focal point. And this is what happens next, isn't
exactly,
it?
Yeah. So she's a celebrity. She is a local celebrity. And you get the sense that this would be very galling to people who either didn't respect her or who wanted some of that power for themselves. What happens is rumours start to travel, and it's not clear who's spreading them, but rumours start to spread among the people of Alexandria. And what they say is not that Hypatia is a scholar or that she's a mathematician. They say instead that she's an agent of Satan, and that she is beguiling Arrestees through her wiles, and that she's using satanic wiles and she's using satanic instruments. So the Christians look at her astrolabes and her symbols that she writes her maths in. And
astrolabes, of course, are astronomical calculators, which help you when you are studying the stars and the planets.
Yes, and they look quite fantastic. And they say that they are instruments of the devil, and that she is doing this, and that with her power, with her satanic power, she is taking Arrestees over to her side. They use this word atheizing. She is taking him away from God. Atheizing, not atheist in the sense that we are, but aim in Greek means almost, and theos is God. So she is ungodding him almost.
Yes.
She's de-godding him, and she's also de-godding the rest of Alexandria as well. So if there's anyone worshipping in Alexandria and they're not worshipping the god, that's probably her fault.
Well, also I imagine that all these students she has who are so overwhelmed by her greatness and her brilliance, they're not likely to be converting to Christianity if they're so she's, in that way, she is a threat to the conversion process, isn't she?
Yes, it's interesting. She could be, and you would think that. What the surprising thing about her is that some quite distinguished Christians come from her school. Oh. So somebody who later goes on to be a great bishop is one of her pupils. So she seems
that
to
is
have
interesting.
been.
So she's very open-minded.
She's very open-minded. She's very hands-off. The impression we get is that she doesn't play a part. She actively seems to step back from the Christian and pagan tensions that are simmering in the city. And it's the thing you read about her. You if you read it hoping that she's going to be an advocate for pagan ways or for an advocate against the Christians, you'll be disappointed, because she never does. She doesn't seem to be at any of the main clashes. She never rejects anyone from her lectures.
So she's almost above that. She's doing the maths.
It's almost
and the
that she's
astronomy.
above it. Yeah.
But that unfortunately does not.
Not above enough. No,
Save
it doesn't
her.
save her. So in 415 AD, these rumours start to spread, and they become fanned by the Parabolani. So the Parabolani start this almost whispering campaign against her, according to the sources. And then one day she goes out of her house on her chariot. She famously went around the city every day on her chariot. It's not clear whether she does this just to greet people or whether it's part of her daily routine, whatever she does. And as she's going on her chariot, she looks up and she sees she is surrounded by a mob of the Parabolani. And at their head is a gentleman called Peter, who we hear is in all respects a perfect believer in Jesus Christ. They stop her and he is in charge. And we don't know quite how it happens, but she is pulled from her chariot. And she must know, because she's friends with Arrestees, she must know this is not good news. She knew what happened to Arrestees. She knew he only escaped by the skin of his teeth. And now the same has happened to her. She's pulled from her chariot. And the descriptions of what happened to her next vary, but most probably they took broken potsherds, which were often used as a weapon in antiquity and used.
What was the word? There's the beautiful
Ostrakon.
Yes.
Ostrakon.
Because it could also be oyster shells, couldn't it?
Yes, it could be oyster shells.
Which is
yes.
sort of even more
awful
but beautiful at the same time.
And they took them and they took the sharp edges and they flayed her alive.
Yeah, you can't imagine.
I mean, no, there are no words. These men must have, in broad daylight on this spring day, March 415 AD, and they flayed her alive. And when they say, some sources say, well, she still gasped for breath, they gouged the eyes from her head.
Oh, stop.
And then again, sources vary as to what happened to her. Some say she was dismembered and taken to a rubbish heap and her limbs thrown on it.
And what was the aftermath of this? I mean, again, if the synagogues being taken over, that must have been a hugely shocking moment for the inhabitants of Alexandria. But this murder must have really, really been the sort of the end of something and the beginning of something new, a sort of moment of absolute change and horror, mustn't it?
I think it feels like that when you read it. I think the most horrific thing that happened was that nothing happened. Nobody seems to have been particularly punished for this. Cyril continues. Cyril continues. And Cyril can distance himself from this violence.
Yeah.
He can wash his hands of it. He can move back from it. Oh, it's the Parabolani. A few laws appear, sort of trying to limit the numbers of Parabolani. But no one is punished for it. And
is it not right that after that, and you can't date it to precisely that moment, it was a very gradual decline, but Alexandria lost its position as the centre of the intellectual world?
Well, I mean, in losing her, it lost the greatest mind in the empire at the time. I mean, she was just brilliant. If you talk to mathematicians who have studied her, she was superlative. So by virtue of her death, it's lost much of its preeminence.
Wow, what a story. So sad and not surprising that it's one of the most famous moments in ancient history, in antiquity. It's one of those things which is really, really, people have always retold the story. Because
it feels in so many ways so unjust, because she had done so much for the city. She herself had been so secular in the sense of never taking sides, and that she should be punished, and that she should be punished so unjustly, and the fact that this wonderful woman of letters is flayed alive, literally, by people who can't even read.
Yeah, but it's incredibly symbolic, isn't it?
Isn't it? Yeah.
I think also the fact that, she was a woman,
yes,
she was educated, and she was pagan. I mean, she just, she had all three of those huge things going against her,
yes,
basically, when it came to the Christian church establishing itself.
And it's that, really, that's what the story is. It is of a rival empire, the state within the state, as you nicely put it, rising up. And it's not so much a story of individuals this period, it is the story of the crushing of the old way of life.
Yeah. And it must have been devastating to witness that as someone who wasn't convinced by the arguments of Christianity. And I know that there are lots of sources of elsewhere in your brilliant book, The Darkening Age, you talk about the philosophers leaving Athens.
Yes, yes.
And how that would have felt to them, yes. Just watching centuries of really, really fantastic intellectual tradition just being kind of ground down.
Yes, slowly ground down. And it does feel that this is a moment from which Alexandria never recovers. And what you see in the writings of philosophers 100 years later, they are still appalled by this. They call them these truly bestial men. But even Christian sources are embarrassed by this. But they are not embarrassed enough, and nobody is punished.
Well, and also, when you describe those people as monks, that's quite shocking, because our modern perception is of a monk is of someone who's very peaceful and
it's the kind of Benedictine monk, isn't it? It's
yes,
the
it is.
Learned
yeah, and that obviously came in much later.
Yes. Well, Benedict, had not yet got going, and I mean, you wrote about it.
Well, yes, that's 100 years later, isn't it? Yeah.
But that learned monk, and the Christian church itself was aware of the threat of these strange, uncivilized, literally outside the civis, outside the city, these monks who obeyed nothing and did nothing that normal.
But I suppose any new faith or regime that is trying to establish itself, I mean, it's almost impossible, isn't it, to do it without some kind of violence, or because you have to remove what has gone before. Well, especially in as you were saying earlier about the Christianity being a monotheistic religion and absolutely no other gods allowed, and that was what really made it so different from what had gone before, where in Egypt there's countless examples of gods where there was an Egyptian god and then the Romans arrived and they just squashed the two together and made another god. It was so sort of open and amorphous, wasn't it?
And it takes a long time for the Christians to persuade them that their God will do everything. There's this wonderful sermon by Augustine, because they arrive and they say, we have the great all-powerful God, and to an extent that's fine, but what they found was that when they wanted to pray over matters of life and death, they would pray to the Christian God, but if their knee was hurting, they'd revert to praying to the pagan God.
Or they wanted the harvest to be good.
They felt that this great all-powerful God wouldn't be worried about their knee or their bunions or whatever. So there's a wonderful sermon by Augustine in which he says, make no mistake, he even sees to the salvation of your hen. So you don't have to go to your bunions, and your knees and all of it. You don't have to go to your other gods. You can use ours. When we tell the story of faith, we see it as the story of as hearts and minds being converted. But as much of that, it was a physical, on-the-ground process of taking back each temple. Every time you see a church that has been converted from a temple into a church, that like as not, there was somebody watching that, and they were feeling
who'd been worshipping in that temple their whole life.
And you can say that, nobody minded. That's not what the sources appear to say, and perhaps the majority of people. It would be weird
if nobody minded.
But it does feel strange. Yes, they changed them shut. They changed the temples shut. They forbade sacrifice. They forbade sacrifice on pain of death.
Yeah.
These laws are being made for somebody.
Yeah, of course, makes complete sense.
Yeah.
So my last question that I have to ask you is, what would you like to bring back with you? You can choose one object or item from 415. What would you bring back to the present?
I think it would have to be one of her astrolabes.
Good choice. Yeah, they are so beautiful.
Yeah, so beautiful. Her hands would have been on it.
Yes. And she might have even designed it, because she was supposed to have been involved in the design and construction.
Yes, wasn't she?
Yeah. Because of course in those days, if you wanted an astrolabe, you couldn't just
pop down
to the shop and buy one. You had to actually build it yourself and design it yourself.
And you imagine her doing it with her father, and you imagine just all of that knowledge, that extraordinary Alexandrian knowledge. It was in Alexandria that Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth.
To within a couple of 100 miles.
Yeah, to within 80 kilometres. Yeah. Amazing.
Really amazing. That's a good choice. Well, if you bring it back, I would like to have a look at it, please. Thank you so much, Catherine. I've really enjoyed our chat, and I hope the listeners have too.
Thank you.
The Darkening Age by Macmillan is available in hardback and paperback in all good bookshops. For our next episode, we're talking to the mathematician Marcus de Sautoy. Thanks so much for listening. Goodbye.